What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with breaking news. The Houston Texans have traded for star wide receiver of the LA Rams, Brandin Cooks. So not long after the Houston Texans got rid of and shipped DeAndre Hopkins, one of the premier receivers in the NFL, to the Arizona Cardinals, there were a lot of reports saying that, hey, that was a terrible trade. And I think the consensus is that was still a pretty bad trade by the Houston Texans. But we kind of knew that the Texans would make some sort of a move to help out Deshaun Watson. Of course, Deshaun Watson is going to be a free agent very soon. And for the Texans to keep him and to make him their franchise guy going forward, they need to support him with the receivers that will make him happy. So before I dive into this breaking trade, Brandin Cooks to the Houston Texans, make sure that you do Gronk spike the like button, and of course, subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL trade reactions, free agency analysis, and draft coverage here on the Bottom Line View. Also, comment your opinion on the trade. What do you think of the trade? Do you think the Rams won this trade? Do you think the Texans won this trade? What do you think of Brandin Cooks as a player right now going into the 2020 season? Let me know in the comment section below. All right, so what was the trade? Well, the trade was Brandin Cooks to the Texans for a second-round pick this season, but the Texans also receive a fourth-round pick. So in really taking a look at it and kind of going through all the details, you would probably assume that this is about a third-round pick in compensation for Brandin Cooks. It is a second-round pick, but when you add Cooks and a fourth-round pick, you kind of take away the fourth and the second equals a third, in my opinion. But either way, the Texans do get Cooks and another player in the draft for a second-round pick. And I think this move actually makes sense for both sides, and I'll explain why. Let's start off with the big news in terms of the Texans, because obviously Brandin Cooks is a bigger name in the NFL in terms of the receiver position, and this is a guy that's played for multiple different teams at this point in his career, and he's still very, very young. So you have to wonder, is there something wrong with Brandin Cooks? Did he do something to deserve to be traded by all of these teams? And not just teams that are okay or mediocre or bad teams, but organizations that have been very successful with Brandin Cooks. I mean, the Patriots went to the Super Bowl with Brandin Cooks, the Saints were successful with Brandin Cooks, and the LA Rams went to the Super Bowl with Brandin Cooks. So what's the issue with Brandin Cooks? Did he do something wrong? Why would McVay, Belichick, and Sean Payton all decide to trade him? There must be a reason behind this. And the only reason I can really give is that Brandin Cooks is making money right now for the Rams that maybe he's not totally deserving of in terms of the production on the field, in terms of what the Rams are actually able to maximize out of him. That's the only thing I can really give you. In terms of why the Patriots traded him, I think they didn't want to pay him that upper echelon wide receiver money, and that's why they traded him to the Rams for a first-round pick. And the Rams end up trading him for basically a second-round pick and giving also away a fourth-round pick, so they didn't get quite what they had to give New England to get this guy in their building, but they did get a couple seasons out of him, especially one good season where they were able to go to the Super Bowl and maximize their window to potentially win a Super Bowl. So when you're looking at the Rams, I do believe this was a successful trade, getting Brandin Cooks from New England. Overall, even though it cost you a first-round pick, and even though he only played 2 seasons for you, you could look at it both ways. It was a successful trade for New England, but it was also a successful trade for the LA Rams. And when it comes to the Saints, I think Sean Payton realized, hey, I'm one of the best offensive coaches in football or whatever. I can draft a guy like Michael Thomas in the later rounds and make him the leading receiver in the NFL because I'm such a great coach and I have Drew Brees and I trust my quarterback to make something out of a receiver that I don't necessarily need to spend a first-round pick, and I'll get that compensation back out of New England, who's looking to give a receiver for Tom Brady at the moment. So there's a lot of different things that you have to kind of calculate and understand from all different avenues. I think when it came to the Saints, The reason they trade him is because Sean Payton's confidence in his offense and his quarterback. The reason why the Patriots trade him is because they didn't want to pay him that money because his contract was up. And then the reason why the Rams traded him is because of their cap situation. Again, they got rid of Gurley for this situation. They couldn't sign Clay Matthews. They couldn't sign Dante Fowler. They've basically tied themselves into a corner and locked themselves in a closet when it comes to their salary cap. I mean, they've done a horrible job of managing their roster. They don't have great depth on their roster. They've spent all of their money in Jared Goff, Aaron Donald, and some unnecessary players, in my opinion. And now they have to pay Jalen Ramsey, so they had to take that into account as well. So their money is really tied into just a couple of players. And I think that's the reason why they looked at somebody like Brandin Cooks and said, yes, he's a good player. Does he make us better? Yes, he does. But when it comes to paying other players that will make us significantly better, it's not worth keeping Brandin Cooks on the contract. Let's get some compensation back for him. And yes, he's already signed long term. So the Texans look at that and say, it's not another DeAndre Hopkins situation where we need to actually pay him going forward. For the Texans, they see a receiver in Brandin Cooks that's a good receiver. Maybe he's not as good as DeAndre Hopkins, but what he actually is a different skill set, and I'll dive a little bit into that in just a sec. But the key thing here with Brandin Cooks is he is going to be making significantly less money on a yearly basis than what DeAndre Hopkins is potentially going to be making in Arizona. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be making $20+ million a year, while Brandin Cooks is going to be making $16-17 million over the next 4 years. And that could actually become a bargain for the Texans going forward, considering that a lot of these other receivers across the NFL are going to get paid. Some guys that I think, are actually better than Brandin Cooks, but they're going to move the price up for Cooks types of receivers that end up going to be overpaid when it comes to comparing them to Brandin Cooks. So I also think when you look at the value of Cooks, his value is very low. So the Texans to actually try and trade for somebody of Brandin Cooks is a classic buy low, sell high scenario where the Rams traded for him maybe at his maximum value or close to his maximum value. And now they got rid of him, the Rams, at his lowest value because he had the worst season of his NFL career last year. And that was for a variety of reasons. The Rams offense fell off last year. Jared Goff did not have a good season last year at the quarterback position. Sean McVay's running game wasn't operating as well with Todd Gurley having the whole knee situation and all of that happening. The offensive line wasn't very good. He kind of fell behind in targets behind Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, who I think Rams fans would argue are more valuable receivers to their team and to their scheme. I will say this about Brandin Cooks. Off the field, he is one of the best receivers to have on your team. The guy is an awesome dude. He's a very hard worker. And the other thing I'll say about Brandin Cooks, he nearly never misses games, snaps, or plays. He is consistent. He's very healthy most of the time. And he basically is a warrior. I mean, the guy's in great shape. And for a player that runs go routes as much as him and stretches the field as much as him, he comes back on the next play and he'll do it again, time after time after time. He's in great shape for a receiver. And that's actually important. That's something that's not really taken into account. But I do think that's something that the Rams will miss. They don't really have a downfield target anymore in their passing game. Robert Woods is a great underneath receiver, great intermediate receiver. Same for Cooper Kupp. Great in the red zone, great in the intermediate, great in the slot. But they don't really have that stretch the field guy that Jared Goff can throw downfield, posts and goes and threaten a defense with their speed. They no longer have that type of receiver, and that receiver is important in the NFL today. Just look at the Chiefs. But you also have to consider that that's going to hurt the entire Rams offense because that's going to make defenses play you differently when you don't have a guy with Brandin Cooks' speed or ability down the field. And also the amount of pass interference calls that this guy is able to rack up season after season. He's one of the best and savviest in that regard as well. So the Rams are going to be hurt as an offense, and I don't think they're really going to be able to find the same type of receiver, but in the draft. They may actually try and draft a replacement for Brandin Cooks. I don't think if they lose Cooks and they all of a sudden they play Reynolds in a bigger role, I don't think their passing game will be significantly worse. But what I'm talking about here is that the overall offense is going to take an impact from it. I think McVay is smart enough to figure out different ways to attack you, but This receiving class, we've talked about it. I mean, there are a lot of guys in this receiving class that are very good. But are there a lot of guys that are Brandin Cooks level of talent? I don't know. Like, there's a lot of young guys in this draft. This is one of the most loaded receiver classes we've ever seen in a long time. But when it comes to, and it's one of the deepest, which I think you need to take into account here, but you don't just find Brandin Cooks' speed every day of the week. And you don't really find that type of commitment, that type of team player, that type of character in your locker room. I think that's why every team has traded for him. And I also think it's because he has that type of playmaking ability in the NFL. This is a receiver who 4 years in a row was a 1,000-yard receiver, basically every year from his second year until last year, his 25-year-old season in 2018, where was actually his most successful from a yardage standpoint with the Rams. 80 receptions, 1,200 yards. That was just a year ago with the Rams. With New England, one season in one of the most difficult offenses to learn in the NFL. He caught 65 balls for 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. I mean, he was great there, and he was good in the playoffs with New England as well. And then with the Saints, I mean, he had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, 8 touchdowns, 9 touchdowns with Drew Brees in that offense. He's proven that he can play in any offense. He's proven that his talent can go from offense to offense to offense. And when you look at the Texans, their offense is most similar to New England's. So you kind of already know how you're going to be able to utilize him within your offense, what type of routes he can run, which he can run basically anything. And the thing I love about Cooks as a player is he can play anywhere. He can play outside. He can play in the slot. He's dangerous. I don't think he's necessarily the greatest intermediate or after the catch receiver. I think those are kind of places that he does struggle a little bit. But when it comes to down the field and it comes to route running down the field and 10 plus yards, he's one of the best in the NFL, one of the crispest route runners down the field in the NFL. And he's super quick in his routes, which make him very difficult to cover man on man on a consistent basis. And like I said, that speed will open up the rest of the offense. So now when you look at the Texans offense, I mean, you have Fuller and you have Cooks. This is one of the fastest receiving groups in the NFL now. And you have Randall Cobb in the slot, which is just going to feast underneath because everybody's going to be worried about Cooks and Fuller. And when you think about the Texans and how they've been successful offensively, it's always been with Fuller on the field and not with Hopkins on the field. The key statistic has always been Watson and the Texans with Fuller, not Watson and the Texans with Hopkins. Whenever Fuller has been out, Hopkins has still been on the field, yet the Texans have not been able to produce those same results without Fuller. And now, pretty much in Cooks, you add a guy that is like Fuller, but he's more consistent. He's going to be on the field, and he brings that same speed element. But now when you have both of them on the field, it's almost a little bit like Tyreek Hill and Sammy Watkins. Now, none of them have the Tyreek Hill type of speed, but they both threaten a defense with their speed vertically. They both are able to run crisp routes and operate with the quarterback. But I do believe that it's like Cooks in terms of Tyreek Hill, where the guy's not really injured that much and is going to consistently be on the field. But whenever you have that Will Fuller or Sammy Watkins, it takes that offense to the next level. That's kind of the way I think about it. And when the Texans are looking at how they lost to the Chiefs, they're seeing that this speed was the reason they lost. Not to mention, Kenny Stills himself is also pretty fast. So you have Kenny Stills, Will Fuller, and you have Brandin Cooks. Those are 3 guys that are dynamic, and this all of a sudden is back to being one of the best receiving groups in the NFL, and I would honestly argue it might actually be better than when they had DeAndre Hopkins because you didn't have Randall Cobb. And I think Randall Cobb can actually give you a lot of the things that Hopkins gave you underneath, and Cooks can give you a lot of the things that Hopkins gave you over top. And you actually add a guy that's a lot faster, and you add a speed element that Hopkins doesn't really have. Hopkins is really great one-on-one in contested catch situations. He's a very good physical receiver who's able to make plays in the intermediate and underneath game because of that, and he's very difficult to cover because he's so physical in his routes, and he's just like a handful for corners. But when it comes to actually threatening a defense vertically, Hopkins doesn't really do that when Cooks and Fuller do that. And then Cobb can give you that underneath element, and Kenny Stills can kind of do everything as well. So I like it. You know, again, the weakness of his game, especially seeing him with New England, was he's not good after the catch. So if you're expecting Brandin Cooks to make plays after the catch, he's really not. Like, despite his speed, he's not great in the screening game. He's not great underneath making a play like Odell Beckham or somebody like that. He's just really good at catching. He's catching the football, separating and catching and making a play, and then going down the field. He's not going to be the guy that's going to break a couple tackles or make a guy miss in the open field. That's not going to happen. So if you're looking for that, that's not going to happen. But I think Watson is surrounded with a great group of weapons now. And from LA's perspective, like I said, they could potentially look to draft a receiver to try and replace him and his skill set. But I don't think, like, in terms of their offense, they're bad. Like, they still have Woods, they still have Cooks, or still have Kupp, my bad, not Cooks. He's gone now. But those two guys alone are, like, still one of the best duos in the NFL, especially if you're trying to operate an underneath offense. They still can utilize those tight ends more, which are underrated and talented. They really need to look at the running back position, I believe, and the offensive line. I think if they could build their offensive line and spend some of that money that was spent on Cooks on the offensive line, their offense will actually be better off for it, and potentially drafting a running back that has some talent would actually help as well. But I think this is a win-win for both sides in a way. I think the Texans win more here, but I do think that the Rams actually kind of do get a pretty good deal for Brandin Cooks, considering that we kind of knew he was going to be on the move, and considering we know that they have bigger needs elsewhere on their offense and on their defense, and considering that Sean McVay kind of knows what he's doing when it comes to offensive football, it makes sense. But you should not be killing Bill O'Brien for this trade. This is a really good move, and maybe this was his play all along. And again, I can't stress this enough, but Brandin Cooks is very good on the field, but he's also great off the field. And I think fans will love him in Houston. He's also a guy that you know is going to be effective anywhere he goes because he's shown that he can be. And I think with a quarterback like Watson, he's going to thrive because he's never really had that type of quarterback before. He's never really had the quarterback that extends plays outside the pocket, where Cooks is so well conditioned, like I brought up earlier, where he'll be able to make plays long after it's extended, like extended for 5-6 seconds. Cooks is nearly impossible to cover for that long because he's so quick and so fast in the open field that he may actually develop this type of Tyler Lockett with Russell Wilson type of chemistry with Watson and Cooks. I could see that very well happening. So those are my thoughts on this move. I think it's an excellent move for the Texans. I think this puts them right back in the conversation for one of the most dynamic offenses and passing games in the NFL. And this also puts them right back in the conversation for that AFC South, where I was a little bit down on them before. Cooks is a good player and will immediately make an impact. So those are my thoughts on this move. Guys, make sure that you do, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. And of course, comment your opinion on what you think of the Cooks trade. Thanks for watching. It's been Mitch.